A friend of mine, his name is Brent, reads Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol every Christmas, one chapter per week, and he finishes the last one on Christmas Eve. I thought this was a great idea, and I did it with him last year. It was a very interesting experience, and I couldn't wait to do it again this year. And then I had an idea. Why don't you join us? As I was reading it last year, I wondered if there was any kind of a correlation between the 5 parts of the book and the 4 candles of Advent plus the Christmas one. And I'll be looking to see if there's any connection. But I already think that reading this novella could be a significant part of our spiritual preparation for Christmas. So I invite you to read A Christmas Carol with Brent and me. And after you read each chapter or stave, you can come here for some thoughts and reflections on what we've read. My hope is that reading Dickens' classic Christmas tale would be a true blessing to you and yours. London was a city of stark contrasts in December 1843. Some neighborhoods had gas lamps. In the wealthier districts, families were beginning to embrace new Christmas traditions. They were decorating evergreen trees like the one Prince Albert brought from Germany. And some sent the first Christmas cards ever. They were first printed around this time. But this is not what it was like for everybody. People in many parts of the city lived in cramped tenements, and even in dark, damp alleyways. Children worked for 12-hour days in factories, and entire families were crammed into single rooms. And if you couldn't pay your bills, you could be sent to the workhouse. And believe me, you didn't want to go to the workhouse. It is into this world that Charles Dickens released what would become perhaps the second most influential Christmas story ever written. A Christmas Carol, in prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. That was the full title. And yes, it was really intended to be a ghost story. But it became so much more. Let's start with the title, A Christmas Carol. A carol is a song that is usually sung around Christmas. You know this. They are usually religious and joyful, about giving, hope, and community. And here's the brilliant part. Dickens structured this novel like a musical composition. Instead of calling his chapters chapters, he called them staves. And that's not just Victorian pretension. A stave, or staff, is the 5 horizontal lines on which musical notes are written. There are 5 staves in this book, just like there are 5 lines in a musical staff. Each stave carries a different note in Scrooge's transformation, from the warning of Marley's ghost, through the spirits, to his final redemption. Dickens wanted readers to experience his story like a Christmas carol, a song that could be shared, sung, and passed on down through the ages. And hey, that's exactly what happened. Dickens was writing a ghost story, and a story set during the Christmas season. But was he writing a Christian story? The answer to this question is beautifully complicated. Dickens wasn't very orthodox in his Christian beliefs. He was more of a humanitarian. He more or less believed that people could save themselves through good works and education. But the story itself is deeply rooted in Christian themes. You probably already know that if you've read it before or seen any of the movies. You could say that the structure of this novella leans heavily into the biblical narrative. How about this? Scrooge could be considered a kind of Old Testament guy who badly misinterpreted the Old Testament. He was all about judgment and law. The Cratchit family is more about love and forgiveness and grace. And notice the names. Bob Cratchit's children are Peter, Martha, and Timothy. That's Tiny Tim. These names are drawn from the New Testament. But that's not all. The story follows a classic theological pattern of sin, a call to repentance, and redemption. This pattern Christians have recognized for centuries. And probably the most obvious Christian influence in this story is that it illustrates the Christian obligation to care for the poor, the sick, and the marginalized. We see this particularly when Scrooge encounters the 2 children, ignorance and want, beneath the robe of the ghost of Christmas present. Here, Dickens is channeling the biblical command to care for the least of these. The story behind the publication of A Christmas Carol is quite interesting and relevant. Dickens wrote this masterpiece in just 6 weeks during the autumn of 1843. He was in serious financial trouble. His latest serialized novel, Martin Chuzzlewit, was flopping, and his publishers were threatening to cut his monthly income by £50. He had a pregnant wife and 4 children to support, and his father was bad with money, and he needed to be taken care of. Dickens was desperate. But money wasn't his only motivation for writing this story. In 1843, he read a parliamentary report about child labor that absolutely horrified him. Children as young as 5 years old were working 12-hour days in factories and mines. Then, in September of that year, he visited Field Lane Ragged School. This was one of the charity schools trying to educate London's street children. What he saw there really shook him. He described it to a friend. "I have very seldom seen, in all the strange and dreadful things I have seen in London or elsewhere, anything so shocking as the dire neglect of soul and body exhibited in these children." This visit directly inspired A Christmas Carol. There are some things that you should know that will increase your enjoyment and understanding of this story. One was just how brutal life was for the working class in Victorian England. The Industrial Revolution had created unprecedented wealth, but also unprecedented poverty. Thomas Malthus, an influential economist, argued that poverty was a natural result of population growth, essentially that some people were surplus and should be allowed to die. This is exactly what Scrooge says of the poor early on in the story. If they would rather die, they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. You should know about the Poor Law of 1834, which established workhouses. These institutions were so harsh and degrading that people would choose starvation rather than to go into them. This is what Bob Cratchit fears when he worries about speaking up to Scrooge. One wrong word and his family could end up in the workhouse. You should also know that child labor was rampant. 5-year-olds in factories and mines. Many families needed their children's wages just to afford living in these cramped tenements. When Dickens shows us Tiny Tim, he's not just creating a sympathetic character, he's representing the thousands of children whose lives hung on the balance. If an employer was annoyed with you, you were finished. And so were your kids. When A Christmas Carol was published on December 19, 1843, all 6,000 copies sold out by Christmas Eve. By the end of 1844, 13 editions had been printed. The book captured something in the Victorians, something they desperately needed. The 1840s were called the Hungry 40s. That's because of all the economic depression, unemployment, and growing urban poverty. People were moving into the cities from the countryside looking for jobs in the factories. As they moved, they lost the rural Christmas traditions, community feasts and celebrations. Dickens sort of showed how Christmas could work in the modern urban world, one that centered on family, generosity, and even crossing the rigid barriers between the classes. So Brent and I invite you to read Stave 1 over the next week, and then return here to watch the video for some observations and comments. This is a wonderful story, but that's not all it is. It's a spiritual experience disguised as entertainment. It's a social manifesto wrapped in a ghost story. And it's a call to transformation, presented as a Christmas tale. Dickens intended to haunt his readers pleasantly, and nearly 2 centuries later, he's still succeeding. So grab your copy, settle into a comfy place, and prepare to be visited by your own spirits of Christmas past, present, and yet to come. The ghost of Dickens' idea is still walking, still calling us to see clearly, care deeply, and to change completely. God bless us, everyone. See you next time.